It was a hot summer day, and the small town of Willow Creek was sweltering under the blazing sun. The air was thick with the smell of cut grass and the distant sound of children playing in the park. But for one family, the day would be anything but idyllic. The Johnsons had just moved into a new house on the outskirts of town, and they were excited to start their new life. They had been looking for a bigger house for months, and they finally found the perfect one, a charming old Victorian with plenty of character and enough space for their growing family. As they unpacked their boxes, they began to notice strange things happening in their new home. Doors would slam shut on their own, and they could hear whispering voices in the dead of night. At first, they tried to ignore it, chalking it up to their imagination. But as the days went on, the strange occurrences became more and more frequent. They would find objects moved around the house, and they would wake up to find scratches on the walls that weren't there the night before. One night, as they were sitting in the living room, they heard a sound coming from upstairs. It was a soft, almost imperceptible tapping sound. They hesitated but eventually decided to investigate. As they climbed the stairs, the tapping grew louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the attic. When they opened the door to the attic, they were greeted by a chilling sight. In the center of the room stood a figure dressed in tattered clothing. Its face was obscured by shadows, but they could see that it was covered in scars and welts. It stared at them with blank, unseeing eyes, tapping its foot impatiently. The Johnsons were frozen in fear, but the figure didn't move. It simply stood there, tapping its foot and staring at them. Finally, with a low, rasping voice, it spoke. "You shouldn't be here," it said. "This house belongs to me." The Johnsons ran from the house that night, never to return. They spent the night in a nearby motel, too scared to even talk about what they had seen. They didn't know what to do or who to turn to, but they knew that they couldn't stay in that house any longer. The next morning, they contacted a local priest, hoping that he could help them. He agreed to come to the house and perform a blessing, but when he arrived, he was struck by the overwhelming sense of evil that permeated the house. He performed the blessing, but it seemed to have no effect. The strange occurrences continued, and the Johnsons were more frightened than ever. One night, they were awakened by a loud banging on the front door. When they went to investigate, they found that the door was being pounded by a pair of skeletal hands. The figure in the attic was back, and it was more menacing than ever. The Johnsons knew that they had to get out of the house for good. They quickly packed their bags and fled, leaving everything behind. They didn't even bother to lock the front door, they just ran to their car and drove away as fast as they could. Years later, the Johnsons returned to Willow Creek, hoping to put the past behind them. They drove past their old house, but it was no longer there. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by time. As they drove away, the Johnsons couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. They knew that they had escaped something terrible, and they were grateful for the chance to start over. But in the back of their minds they knew